Sarah Mitchell pressed the worn dollar bill against the courthouse window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the auctioneer's gavel rise one final time. The wind howled through the empty streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona, carrying with it the dust of broken dreams and abandoned homesteads. It was 1887, and the frontier was dying a slow death, taking with it the last remnants of hope for folks like Sarah who had nowhere left to run. The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert air like a rusty blade, going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the back for $1. Sarah's heart sank as she turned to see a tall stranger in a weathered duster coat step forward, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hat. She had been living in the old Brennan Ranch house for 3 months now, ever since her father disappeared into the unforgiving wilderness, leaving behind nothing but debt and whispered rumors of gold fever. The bank had foreclosed, and she had been squatting in the abandoned property, surviving on wild berries and the occasional rabbit she could snare. Thomas Hartwell counted out the single dollar with methodical precision, his calloused fingers betraying years of hard labor. At 28, he had worked everything from cattle drives to silver mines, saving every penny for this moment. The Brennan Ranch wasn't much to look at, with its sagging roof and broken fence posts, but it sat on 200 acres of prime grazing land, and more importantly, it was his. After years of drifting from town to town, sleeping under stars and dodging bullets, he finally had a place to call home. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas loaded his few possessions onto his horse and rode toward his new property. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing sentinel against the vast blue sky. As he crested the hill overlooking the ranch, he noticed something that made him pull up short. Smoke was rising from the chimney of the main house, thin and steady against the cloudless horizon. Sarah heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider. She had been preparing a meager supper of beans and hardtack when the sound sent ice through her veins. For weeks, she had managed to avoid detection, keeping the fires small and only during daylight hours. Now, as she peered through the cracked window, she saw him dismounting near the front porch, his movements deliberate and cautious. This had to be the new owner, the man who had bought her sanctuary for the price of a loaf of bread. Thomas approached the house with his hand resting on the grip of his Colt revolver. In his experience, squatters in abandoned properties were usually desperate men with nothing left to lose, the kind who would shoot first and ask questions later. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing only shadows within. He could smell the faint aroma of cooking food, and somewhere inside, he could hear the soft sound of someone moving about. "I know you're in there," Thomas called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced down his share of trouble. "I'm the new owner of this property, and I'm giving you one chance to come out peaceful-like before I come in after you." The silence that followed was broken only by the creaking of the old house settling in the heat. Sarah's mind raced as she considered her options. She could try to slip out the back window and make a run for it, but where would she go? The nearest town was 20 miles away across hostile desert, and she had no horse, no supplies, and barely enough water to last a day. Her father's old rifle leaned against the wall beside her, but she had never fired it at another human being, and she wasn't sure she could start now. "Please," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not armed, and I'm not looking for trouble. I'll come out, but I need you to know that I've got nowhere else to go." She took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway, her hands raised to show she posed no threat. Thomas felt his breath catch in his chest as he saw her for the first time. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like burnished copper. Her dress was patched and faded, but clean, and her green eyes held a mixture of fear and defiance that spoke of someone who had learned to survive against long odds. This was not what he had expected to find on his new property. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that had been ingrained in him since childhood. "I don't mean you any harm, but I need to know what you're doing in my house." He kept his distance, noting the way she held herself ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Sarah straightened her shoulders, finding strength in honesty. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. My father owned the land adjacent to this ranch until the bank took it 6 months ago. He went looking for gold in the Superstition Mountains and never came back. I've been staying here because I had nowhere else to go, and the house was empty. I haven't damaged anything, and I've been keeping it clean and maintained." The story hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had been an orphan himself, passed from one reluctant relative to another until he was old enough to strike out on his own. He understood what it meant to have nowhere to turn, no safety net to catch you when the world decided to knock you down. But he also knew that kindness could be a luxury that frontier life rarely afforded. "Miss Mitchell," he said carefully, "I appreciate your honesty, and I can see you've been taking good care of the place. But this is my property now, bought and paid for, and I need to ask you to gather your things and move on." Even as he said the words, he felt the wrongness of them settling in his stomach like a stone. Sarah nodded, fighting back tears that would only make her appear weaker than she already felt. "I understand, Mr. She let the question hang in the air between them. Hartwell, Thomas Hartwell. He watched as she disappeared back into the house, returning moments later with a canvas bag that appeared to contain everything she owned in the world. The sight of it twisted something deep in his chest, reminding him of his own desperate days when all his possessions fit in a single saddlebag. As Sarah walked past him toward the desert, Thomas found himself speaking before he could stop the words. Miss Mitchell, wait. She turned back to him, hope flickering in her eyes like a candle flame in the wind. This is harsh country for anyone to face alone, especially a woman. The nearest town is a hard day's walk, and there are dangers out there that he trailed off, struggling with a decision that went against every lesson he had learned about protecting himself first. I could work for my keep, Sarah said quickly, sensing his hesitation. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, tend to animals. I know this. Land, know where to find water, and which plants are safe to eat. I wouldn't be a burden, I promise. The desperation in her voice was carefully controlled, but Thomas could hear it nonetheless. Thomas studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only honest need. He had planned to work the ranch alone, to build something from nothing through sheer determination and backbreaking labor. Taking on a partner, especially a female partner, would complicate everything, but the alternative was watching an innocent woman walk into the desert to die, and that was something his conscience wouldn't allow. There would have to be conditions, he said finally. This arrangement would be strictly business. You would have your own quarters, and there would be no ... impropriety. You would work hard, pull your weight, and follow my lead when it comes to running this operation. And if it doesn't work out, you agree to move on without causing trouble. Sarah felt relief flood through her like cool water after a long drought. Yes, Mr. Hartwell, I agree to all of that. You won't regret this decision. She extended her hand to shake on the agreement, and Thomas noticed how small it felt in his own rough palm. How soft, despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. The first few weeks of their arrangement passed in a blur of backbreaking labor and careful politeness. Thomas threw himself into repairing the ranch with the intensity of a man trying to outrun his own doubts. He fixed the sagging roof, replaced broken fence posts, and cleared brush from the grazing areas while Sarah transformed the interior of the house from a neglected shell into something resembling a home. She proved to be as capable as she had promised, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, tending a small garden she planted behind the house, and working alongside him when an extra pair of hands was needed. She could shoot his father's old rifle with surprising accuracy, bringing down rabbits, and the occasional deer that wandered too close to the property. Her cooking turned simple ingredients into meals that actually tasted good, a luxury Thomas hadn't experienced in years of bachelor living. But it was the small things that began to affect him most, the way she hummed while she worked, filling the house with music it had never known. The sight of her hanging laundry on the line she had strung between two posts, her dress billowing in the desert wind, the sound of her laughter when his horse, a temperamental stallion named Duke, refused to cooperate with his attempts at training. Sarah found herself watching Thomas when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the careful way he handled injured animals, the patience he showed when teaching her to repair harness leather, the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. He was nothing like the rough men who frequented the saloons in town. Men who looked at women, like Sarah, as objects to be used and discarded. Thomas treated her with a respect she had never experienced before, and it stirred feelings in her that she had thought were dead. The first real test of their partnership came 6 weeks after Sarah's arrival, when a group of cattle rustlers decided the isolated ranch looked like easy pickings. Thomas was working on the windmill when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. 5 riders approaching at a leisurely pace that suggested they weren't in any hurry to avoid detection. Sarah, he called toward the house. Get inside and stay away from the windows. We've got company coming, and I don't think they're here to welcome us to the neighborhood. He checked his weapons, making sure his rifle was loaded and his sidearm was secure in its holster. The riders were a rough-looking bunch, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their clothes dusty from long days in the saddle. Their leader was a big man with a black beard and cold eyes that seemed to take inventory of everything they saw. They pulled up in front of the house and sat their horses with the casual arrogance of men who were used to taking what they wanted. Afternoon, the leader called out, "Name's Jake Morrison. Me and my boys are looking for work. Wondered if you might have need of some extra hands around here." His tone was friendly enough, but there was something in his smile that made Thomas's skin crawl. "I appreciate the offer," Thomas replied, keeping his rifle visible but not pointed directly at the visitors. "But I'm not hiring right now. You boys might want to try the Double Bar Ranch about 15 miles north. I heard they're looking for drovers." Morrison's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "That's real neighborly of you, friend. But see, we're not exactly looking for regular work, if you catch my meaning. This is mighty fine land you got here, mighty isolated too. A man could run into all sorts of trouble out here, especially if he doesn't have friends to watch his back." Thomas felt the familiar tightening in his gut that always preceded trouble. He had dealt with men like Morrison before, bullies who used intimidation and violence to take what they couldn't earn honestly. "I appreciate your concern for my welfare," he said evenly, "but I can take care of myself just fine. Now I'm going to have to ask you and your boys to move along." "That's not very friendly," Morrison said, his hand dropping casually to rest on his gun butt. "Maybe you don't understand the situation here. This is dangerous country. Lots of things can happen to a man living all alone. Accidents, you might say." The sound of a rifle being cocked came from the house, clear and unmistakable in the desert air. Morrison and his men turned to see Sarah, standing in the doorway, her father's Winchester trained on the group with steady hands. "He's not alone," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Sarah, taking in her determined stance and the way she held the rifle like someone who knew how to use it. Well, looks like you got yourself a woman, after all. Mighty pretty too. Maybe we should stick around, get better acquainted." "That would be a mistake," Thomas said, and now his own rifle was pointed directly at Morrison's chest. "A big one. You've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out of here before this gets unpleasant for everybody." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Morrison weighed his options. He was facing two armed defenders, on their own ground, and while he might be faster with a gun than the rancher, the woman in the doorway looked like she could put a bullet in him before he cleared leather. After a long moment, he raised his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Easy there, friend. No need to get all worked up. We were just being neighborly." He turned to his men. "Come on, boys, doesn't look like these folks appreciate good company." As they wheeled their horses around, Morrison called back over his shoulder, "You might want to think about what I said though. Accidents happen all the time out here." Thomas kept his rifle trained on the group until they disappeared over the ridge, then lowered it with a shaky exhale. He turned to find Sarah still standing in the doorway, her weapon now pointed at the ground but still ready. The look in her eyes was one he had seen before, in the faces of soldiers who had just faced their first real battle. "You did good," he told her as he approached the house. "That took courage, standing up to men like that." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. He said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." She leaned the rifle against the doorframe and rubbed her arms as if she were cold, despite the desert heat. "He was a wise man," Thomas said. "But those men won't give up easy. Morrison and his kind don't like being backed down, especially not by a woman. They'll be back, probably with more men." The knowledge that they were now marked for trouble hung between them like a dark cloud. Thomas spent the next few days reinforcing their defenses, setting up firing positions around the house and barn, checking and rechecking their weapons and ammunition. Sarah threw herself into preparations as well, stockpiling food and water, gathering medical supplies in case someone got hurt. It was during those tense days of waiting that something shifted between them. The formal politeness that had characterized their relationship began to give way to something deeper, born of shared danger and mutual dependence. They found themselves working together with an efficiency that surprised them both, anticipating each other's needs and movements as if they had been partners for years rather than weeks. One evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the desert, Sarah broke the comfortable silence between them. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, "why did you really let me stay? And don't say it was just because you needed the help." Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go," he said. "When I was 15, my uncle threw me out of his house, with nothing but the clothes on my back. Said I was old enough to make my own way in the world." He paused, lost in memories that still had the power to hurt. "I spent 3 days walking across Texas prairie with no food, no water, no idea where I was going. I probably would have died if a rancher named Jim Kellaway hadn't found me collapsed by the side of a creek. He gave me work, taught me everything I know about cattle and horses and surviving on the frontier." Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. Thomas continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Jim had a heart attack 2 years later. His widow couldn't run the ranch alone, had to sell it to pay his debts. I went back to drifting, but I never forgot what that kindness meant to me. When I saw you standing there with that little bag, looking like you were trying to be brave while your world fell apart, I guess I saw myself." The honesty of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected him to say something about needing help with the work, or maybe feeling sorry for her situation. She hadn't expected him to reveal something so personal, so painful. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as more than just a problem to be solved." "You're not a problem, Sarah," Thomas said, and the way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. You're the best thing that's happened to this place. Hell, you're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I care to admit." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither was quite ready to explore. They sat in silence as the stars began to appear overhead, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future might hold. Morrison and his gang returned 3 nights later. Under cover of darkness and with reinforcements, Thomas was awakened by Duke's nervous nickering from the corral, a sound that had saved his life more than once during his wandering years. He slipped out of bed and moved to the window, peering carefully through a crack in the shutters. He could see movement in the darkness, shadows that didn't belong to the natural landscape. At least 8 men, maybe more, spreading out to surround the house and barn. They had come prepared for a siege, with enough firepower to overwhelm 2 defenders. Through sheer numbers, Thomas moved quickly but quietly to Sarah's room, tapping softly on her door. She answered immediately, already dressed and holding her rifle, having been awakened by the same instinct that had roused him. "How many?" she whispered. "Too many," he replied grimly. "They've got us surrounded. Our only chance is to make them pay so high a price that they decide it's not worth it." He handed her a box of ammunition and checked his own weapons one final time. The attack began with a shout from Morrison, demanding that they come out with their hands up. When no response came from the house, the rustlers opened fire, filling the night air with the crack of rifles and the whine of bullets striking wood and stone. Thomas and Sarah moved through the house like dancers in a deadly ballet, firing from different windows to make it appear they had more defenders than they actually did. Sarah's marksmanship proved deadly accurate, and more than one rustler learned too late that the woman in the house was not to be underestimated. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The rustlers had expected easy pickings, a quick raid that would net them cattle, horses, and whatever valuables the ranch might contain. Instead, they found themselves pinned down by disciplined fire from defenders who knew every inch of their territory. Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire. "This is your last chance. Hartwell, send out the woman and we'll let you live." The crude laughter that followed his demand made Thomas's blood boil with rage. "Go to hell," Thomas shouted back, punctuating his response with a rifle shot that came close enough to Morrison's head to part his hair. The rustler leader dove for cover behind a water trough, cursing fluently. It was Sarah who noticed the orange glow beginning to flicker against the barn wall. "Thomas," she called urgently, "they're trying to burn us out." One of the rustlers had managed to work his way close enough to the building to set fire to a pile of hay bales. Thomas knew they had only minutes before the fire spread to the main structure, trapping them inside a burning building. "We have to make a run for it," he told Sarah. "There's a wash about 50 yards behind the house. If we can reach it, we might be able to work our way around to higher ground." Sarah nodded, understanding that their situation had just become desperate. They gathered what ammunition they could carry and prepared to make their break for freedom. "On my count," Thomas whispered, 1, 2, 3. They burst through the back door together, running in a zigzag pattern toward the wash while bullets whistled around them. Sarah felt something tug at her sleeve, and Thomas grunted as a bullet creased his shoulder, but they kept moving. Behind them, the barn was now fully engulfed in flames, sending sparks and embers dancing into the night sky. They reached the wash and tumbled down its steep sides, landing hard on the rocky bottom. Thomas was bleeding from his shoulder wound, but he waved off Sarah's concern. "It's not bad," he said through gritted teeth. "We need to keep moving before they figure out where we went." They worked their way along the wash, using its banks for cover, until they reached a point where they could climb out and gain the high ground Thomas had spotted. From their new vantage point, they could see the rustlers silhouetted against the flames of the burning barn, searching the area around the house. "We can pick them off from here," Sarah said, raising her rifle, but Thomas caught her arm. "Wait," he said, "listen." In the distance they could hear the sound of hoofbeat, multiple horses approaching at a gallop. Both Thomas and Sarah tensed, expecting more rustlers, but the riders who appeared were wearing badges that glinted in the FIRELIGHT. Sheriff Coleman of Copper Ridge had received word of the trouble and ridden out with a posse of 6 men. The rustlers, caught between the burning ranch and the approaching lawmen, found themselves in an impossible position. Some tried to fight, others attempted to flee, but in the end, Morrison and 4 of his men were captured while the rest escaped into the desert. As dawn broke over the Arizona landscape, Thomas and Sarah stood in the ruins of their barn, surveying the damage by the pale light of morning. The house had been saved, but most of their equipment and feed stores were gone, reduced to smoldering ashes and twisted metal. "We can rebuild," Sarah said quietly, slipping her hand into Thomas's uninjured one. "It'll take time and money we don't have, but we can do it." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, then up at Sarah's soot-streaked face. "We?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that made her heart skip a beat. "If you'll have me," she replied, not as hired help or a business partner, but as something more. "As someone who wants to build a life here with you, face whatever comes next together." Thomas felt something tight in his chest finally loosened, a wall he had built around his heart crumbling like the burned remains of their barn. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I can't offer you much. This ranch is mortgaged to the hilt. I've got maybe $50 to my name, and as you can see, trouble seems to follow me wherever I go. Is that a no? Sarah asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the fear that was growing in her chest. That's me asking if you're sure, Thomas replied. Because once I say yes, once I admit that I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you in my house, there's no going back. We'll be in this together. Whatever comes. Sarah reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Thomas Hartwell, I've been sure since the night you let me stay, instead of sending me into the desert to die. I've been sure every day since then, watching you work to build something good and lasting out here. And I was never more sure than last night, when we stood together against those men. Thomas pulled her close, mindful of his wounded shoulder, and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the future seemed to stretch out before them like the endless Arizona sky. 6 months later, Thomas and Sarah Hartwell stood hand in hand outside the small church in Copper Ridge, having just exchanged vows before God and the small community that had rallied to help them rebuild their ranch. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, while Thomas sported a new suit purchased with money from their first successful cattle sale. The ranch had prospered beyond their wildest dreams, aided by Thomas's knowledge of ranching and Sarah's intuitive understanding of the land. They had expanded their operation, hired 3 full-time hands, and were already making plans for a larger house to accommodate the family they hoped to start. But more than the material success, they had found something neither had expected when Sarah first walked out of that house with everything she owned in a canvas bag. They had found love, real and lasting, and strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might throw at them. They had found partnership, the kind where 2 people complement each other so perfectly that they become stronger together than either could be alone. As they climbed into the buckboard that would take them back to their ranch, Sarah reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought them together: a dollar bill, a foreclosure auction, and the desperation of a young woman with nowhere else to turn had somehow transformed into this moment of perfect happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noticing the distant look in his new wife's eyes. "Just wondering what would have happened if you had bid $2 instead of 1. Sarah replied with a smile. "Would some other man have bought the ranch? Would I have been forced to leave before you ever arrived?" Thomas considered this as he guided their horse down the dusty road toward home. "I don't think so," he said finally. "I think somehow, some way, we would have found each other. Some things are just meant to be." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas and Sarah Hartwell began their new life together, secure in the knowledge that they had found something more precious than gold, more valuable than land or cattle or any material possession. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found home. The ranch that had been purchased for a single dollar had become the foundation for a love story that would endure for generations. Proof that sometimes the most valuable things in life come not from great wealth or grand gestures, but from simple human kindness, courage in the face of adversity, and the willingness to open one's heart to unexpected possibilities. Years later, when Thomas and Sarah were old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren on the porch of the grand house they had built to replace the original homestead, they would still tell the story of how their love began with a dollar bill and a desperate gamble on an uncertain future. It became a family legend, passed down through the generations. A reminder that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the best investments are the ones made with the heart rather than the head. The Hartwell ranch remained in the family for over a century, a testament to what 2 people could build when they combined love with determination and refused to let hardship defeat them. And though the frontier era passed into history, though the wild land was tamed and cities rose where once only desert bloomed, the story of Thomas and Sarah Hartwell endured as a reminder of a time when a man's word was his bond, when love was something worth fighting for, and when a single dollar could change 2 lives forever.